Simulations. Not so long ago, we lived in the future. At least, it felt like that. There was an optimism, and the feeling of progress, that things are getting better. The end of history has really happened. Not that everything was good. The world had obvious problems, injustices, but there was the belief that step by step, things will get sorted out. There was hope. That in this belief there was a lot of naivety involved, and this was also a very Eurocentric or Western-centric worldview, is quite clear though. In comparison, today's world feels quite the opposite. After we had a global pandemic and lived in isolation for 2 years, Russia invaded Ukraine, Israel is erasing Gaza. Across the board, everyone complains about migration. The European Union abolishes the right to asylum. While forests are burning, floods are happening. The temperatures are going from record high to record high. It's a world of insanity, of chaos, of disruption, of apocalypse. Reality is getting out of hand. Reality becomes too real. Reality gets mixed up with fiction. Reality starts feeling like a bad trip. A badly written Hollywood movie. A fiction, a simulation. We live in the Matrix. AI is taking over. Take the red pill and become a Nazi. Yeah, how could the Nazis appropriate the Matrix? Because they didn't understand it and they don't even care. However, I also want to use the Matrix here for my purposes. Do we live in a simulation? Of course not, at least not a literal simulation. But that's also not what the Nazis and incels and alpha men want to tell us with their red pill analogy. They want to tell us that the blue-pilled people are intoxicated by the woke drug that makes us all gay or trans, and makes us all want to exchange all white people with non-white people, which is a coordinated action by George Soros, / the Illuminati / the Jews in general, of course. That's of course not the direction I want to go, quite the opposite. So let's not take any pills, but look at the world from above. When you look at the world from above, everything looks like a simulation. Every person, every house, every tree, every animal, every car, like parts of a computer game. A simulated world. A hypothetical view of the world from the outside, from a divine perspective, turns the world into a simulation. Which, if you see the world in purely physical terms, it is. It would be a simulation that can be calculated, in which there is no chance. All decisions made by living beings, all things that happen, are actually just the result of physical events. But we can also approach the idea of the world as a simulation from exactly the other direction. That everything we experience is just a dream, a TV show, as for Truman in The Truman Show. Or just a simulation, as it is simulated by a divine AI in Matrix, which cannot be refuted, as everything we experience is based on our sensory perceptions, and these could simply be simulated, but I've already covered that in my last film. This is about the world as a simulation. More precisely, about different types of simulations. About different simulations in which we all find ourselves in, and those that we create. And simulations that we create and then enter into. But what I'm actually talking about here? What are simulations? Conventional simulations are something abstract, detached from reality, but simulating reality. A model is built in which processes of the real world are simulated. The simulation is then used to draw conclusions about the real world. For example, how the weather will be the next week, or how the earth plates will move in order to predict earthquakes, or how the climate will develop. Or a program is built in which a certain activity is simulated. For example, you can sit in a flight simulator and control an airplane without actually piloting one. But when a person sits in a flight simulator, which then controls an actual flying drone that kills people, or autonomously driving cars move in a simulation of the real world, but they also move in the real world at the same time, the distinction between simulation and the real world becomes blurred. How our world is increasingly becoming a simulation. Contemporary cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is a genre set in a dystopian future, in which the world is already half a simulation, where simulation and reality can no longer be distinguished, where AIs become humans and humans become AIs. But there's another characteristic that is key for the genre. In cyberpunk, large corporations have seized power, and politics, if they exist at all, are merely a puppet of these large corporations. The police is not organized by the state, but by these large corporations. Like everything else, they have been privatized, and climate change has already taken place. There's virtually no nature left. But if we look at today's world, we might think that cyberpunk is not so far away. Hollywood films are huge commercials, not as in the past with isolated product placements, but rather for a specific product, such as Barbie or Super Mario. Ads for Candy Crush appear in the sky of New York City. In California, a group of billionaires have secretly bought 200 square kilometers of land to build a private city. The gap between rich and poor is widening, with the richest 1% owning half of all goods worldwide, while the entire poorer half only owns 0.75%. The 26 richest people in the world alone own as much as the poorer half of the world's population. In other words, 26 individual people own as much as 4 billion people. And this is the global situation. Things are not much better in the Western world. In Germany, 45 individuals own as much as the poorer half of the population. In the USA, 3 people own as much as the poorer half. We can speak of a global neo-feudalism here. Rents in cities are exploding, with no prospect of an end, and no political will to stop it. And last but not least, species are dying out on an apocalyptic scale, and we are all seeing climate change happen, and there is no substantial political will to do anything about it. And the storyline that one of the richest people in the world owns a privatized form of NASA and the largest satellite network in the world, with which he can influence wars, and who has also bought the politically most important social network, on which his biographer publishes intimate details about him, and as a result, one of the mothers of his children, a famous musician and transhumanist, begs him to be allowed to see her child, feels like it's straight out of a bad absurdist cyberpunk comedy. Except that it's all really happening. So we are racing towards a concrete wall at top speed on several levels without even thinking about hitting the brakes. The consequences of climate change are becoming more and more noticeable. Inequality is increasing, the super rich are becoming ever more powerful, and most people spend the majority of their income on rent alone. At the same time, if you look what is happening in politics and the media, you get the impression that everything is normal, that there's nothing to worry about. Now you can say that politics and the media are in their own simulation anyway, and always have been. But in society, too, everything is simply accepted as normal. Although these issues affect us all directly and should be a top priority, they are politically marginalized at best. In the media, they are dealt with in magazines and documentaries that are shown on TV at midnight and are only watched by a specific group of people, but the main discourse is about fake problems, such as too much migration. Culture wars are fought, from which only the conservatives to the extreme right benefit. Or absurd discussions are held about whether we should start building nuclear power plants again. While at the same time, nuclear power plants cannot be operated, because there is no water in the rivers to cool them, because it's too hot. I wonder why that might be. There's also the narrative that we are in permanent crisis mode, which contradicts the narrative of normality. However, these crises are seen as external crises of higher force that happen outside of normality. In fact, these crises are also used as a tool to avoid having to deal with normal issues, as we first have to overcome a crisis. Which is insane because the housing crisis or the climate crisis are also crises we should deal with right now. But politically, these crises are hardly ever addressed. And if they are, it is far too late. Like the shift to the right in the Western world, where attempts have been made far too long, both politically and in the media, to integrate it dialectically into the discourse instead of fighting it. This integration of the far right into the discourse has worked very well, but the new right parties still exist, more right-wing extremist and more powerful than ever. And it has become completely normalized, across all political divides, right into the so-called left camp, to say that too much immigration is a problem. Which is wrong on several levels. On the one hand, it's simply racist to reject immigration in general, but it's also wrong from a capitalist point of view, as aging societies need immigration in order not to go under economically. In other words, the people that Donald Trump, the AfD, or even Olaf Scholz want to deport can no longer be exploited by working for too little money, for which there are already too few people when they are no longer here. But never mind. In the EU, the right to asylum is being abolished, and the German so-called Coalition for Progress of Social Democrats, Greens, and more far-right liberals is celebrating this as a historic success in case of the Social Democrats, while the Green Party has agreed to this compromise with a stomachache. However, if the compromise is to abolish the right to asylum, one of the universal human rights, this is relatively irrelevant, because it's simply far-right politics that should not be agreed to, with stomachache or not. What is going on here? And why is there no social uproar? Why is everyone staying calm? The excuse of having achieved at least something cannot be accepted in the case of right-wing extremist politics. Something else is going on here. The simulation of progressive politics. Because on the other hand, there has been actual progress in society. Films are becoming more diverse. Racism and queerphobia are no longer so overlooked. All in all, we have become more open, more alert, more critical over the last few decades. How does that work together? My point in this video is not to pit these two sides, social progress against fundamental criticism of the system, identity politics focused on the individual against structural injustice, against each other. Rather, I'm of the opinion that both are true, that they exist in parallel. Great social progress and the simultaneous ignorance of massive problems in the same society, among the same people. And of course it's not the case that nobody sees the problems. On the contrary, they are visible and omnipresent everywhere. We are all affected by them, which makes the situation even more bizarre. We simply accept certain changes in the world as developments that we can't do anything about, and don't even see how much socio-political, identity-political issues are linked to structural issues. We have created a simulation in society in which it is enough to raise a pride flag to do something against homophobia and transphobia, in which it is enough to paint a large Black Lives Matter sign on the street to put an end to racist police violence, in which it is enough to frame a 2-hour commercial for a sexually charged children's doll in feminist terms to make a statement against sexism or the patriarchy. At the same time, it is of course a huge milestone that queerness, for example, has become so normalized, that rainbow flags can be seen everywhere, and the vast majority of people support it, or at least have no problem with it. Much of this can, rightly, be described as pinkwashing or whitewashing, which allows companies that most likely don't care about these issues to distract from the fact that they are terrible companies that let children make their products, destroy the environment, etc. Nevertheless, these developments do have their positive sides. But what is completely lost in the liberal identity politics discourse is, for example, in the case of the hugely celebrated Black Lives Matter street, contrary to the clear demand of the movement, defund the police, which the mayor of Washington, for example, has also made her own. In Washington, and in many other cities in the USA, not less, but more money has been invested in the police as a result. And racist police violence in the USA has not diminished either. But in the simulation, this is ignored. It is a fictitious world, in which we live in the best possible system, in which everyone can make it, in which everything is good overall. And if something is not good, then there are solutions. However, as this quick solution does not exist in reality, when we are dealing with structural issues, the simulation becomes increasingly detached from reality, as the problems naturally continue to exist and cannot be solved fictionally. And in this mindset that everything is good, and above all, we, the West, are the good guys.
Und wir in Europa, wir sind die helle Seite der Macht, wir sind die Guten.
We enter a political simulation in which everything settles down. The right thing is not decided ideologically, but dialectically, in discourse. Just as the free market regulates everything in libertarian ideology and no rules are needed, there is no need for a clear direction in democracy either. Things regulate themselves dialectically, and in the end, the right thing comes out of it. The separation of structural economic conditions and social justice, which leads to this shift in reality, also has ideological origins. In the ideology of the third way, propagated by Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, or Emmanuel Macron, there are no ideologies. There is no left and there is no right, there's only the center. their social democratic policies are not about fundamentally changing economic conditions, but about supporting the individual in their life. This pseudo-neutral policy, which negates structural problems, inevitably leads to a separation of reality and political simulation, as the negation of structures does not, of course, abolish the structures themselves. They are still there. The relativity of the Golden Gate Bridge. In San Francisco, in a nice shabby cafe in Soma, I met an elderly man, Michael, an anarchist, who told me that Albert Einstein was influenced by Hegel's dialectic philosophy when developing the theory of relativity. And, based on that, the architect of the Golden Gate Bridge, inspired by the dialectical simultaneous non-simultaneity, designed the Golden Gate Bridge, which by its construction is simultaneously fixed and mobile, moving relative to the movement of the world, to the wind and weather, to the force of the ocean. Of course, the architect of the Golden Gate Bridge did not invent the concept of the suspension bridge, and I also consider Hegel's idea of a dialectic that strives for the realization of an absolute truth to be too one-dimensional, since Hegel wants to resolve contradictions dialectically, and I would rather go in the direction of enduring contradictions dialectically, of accepting the relativity of different truths. Nevertheless, I found the story inspiring, and, in relation to the simultaneous developments of the world in opposite directions, very fitting, as the view of the world as a place in which there are an infinite number of different realities, in which, depending on the perspective, everything is relative, but at the same time, everything, according to the theory of relativity, is linked together via time and space, helps to understand how simulation and reality diverge further and further. On the one hand, the big picture doesn't exist. Every person has to deal with their own problems, every society with its own. But all societies added up, the global society, with all its relativities, perspectives and realities, also has to deal with its problems. And here we have the big picture again, but in a dialectical, multidimensional, fluctuating form, intertwined in time and space. And this fluctuation also means that there are different truths at the end, that history is riddled with fractures that cannot be explained in a purely logical, one-dimensional way. However, the simulated, dialectic and contemporary political discourse ignores all these fractures, the multidimensionality, the intricacy of history. It is not intricate at all. On the contrary, it can hardly be surpassed in its one-dimensionality, and it works like this. We have a democratic society. In this society, there is a spectrum of opinions. This spectrum of opinion is evenly distributed between left and right, with a center of gravity in the middle. There are small extreme outliers at the edges, but they are so small that they are not so relevant. The democratic society elects political actors, who correspond to their respective position in the spectrum of opinion. The elected political actors now dialectically negotiate, calculate the right political decisions. In this spectrum of opinion, there is no evaluation of what is good or what is bad. According to Habermas, coming from Hegel, the logic of dialectics, of thesis, antithesis, and the resulting synthesis leads to the right decision. This simple dialectical model may have worked quite well in a homogeneous, male-dominated European reality, in which everything else, different, foreign, was not perceived as part of it anyway, and climate change was already predicted but not yet perceptible. But in the opening up, having to open up, heterogeneous, more and more globally connected world in which we live today, in which we can observe an enormous shift to the right that doesn't stop at the far-right parties, this dialectic can no longer work, as there are no truths and falsehoods between which there can be no solution of dialectical compromise. There are real, clearly defined problems and clear developments, both in terms of economic conditions, locally and globally, and climate change. And there are also clear lies that can be clearly described as lies. There must be a consensus, and an absolute truth must be accepted. Otherwise, we will get lost. Lost in a postmodern, post-factual age. What, in fact, is already happening at the moment. What the media and politics do, however, is, nonetheless, maintain the simulation of dialectics, the ideology of post-ideology, of unconditional compromise. And so this dialectically simulated center is shifting further and further to the right, day by day, further and further. A little glimpse of hope right now is coming from the USA, where, since Joe Biden sat back as presidential candidate and opened the stage for Kamala Harris, the bleak mood of hopelessness and inevitable doom shifted to a more optimistic, looking forward mindset, simply by calling the Trumpians weird.
Us MAGA Republicans banned abortion, but that's just the start.
That's just the start.
If Trump gets elected, we want the government involved in all aspects of your sex life.
Way more involved.
Way more involved.
When you have sexual intercourse, it should be illegal to use contraception. No pills, no condoms.
Your genitals are reserved for procreation.
If you freeze 12 eggs, you should be required to have 12 babies, or else you're a serial killer. And I'm definitely not a serial killer.
Are you?
My son monitors my porn usage to make sure I'm not self-pleasuring.
Just like Speaker of the House Mike Johnson. That's true, you can look it up.
Don't you think that's normal?
Yeah, I do.
It's normal for your son to do that.
You should have a family member monitor your porn use too.
Because pleasuring yourself is very, very naughty.
I'm voting in November.
I'm voting in November.
We're all voting in November. Are you?
Because what happens in your bedroom is up to me.
Is up to me and my son. Also, mouth stuff is a sin.
It can be that easy. Those people are not normal. They are fucking weirdos. And so far, this new strategy seems to work. Of course, the Democrats in the US are still practicing neoliberal politics, but at least they finally figured out a way to break the insane logic of "we'll meet in the middle" that was the status quo until now. So maybe from here we can go somewhere. And just to be clear, I'm not against a dialectical discourse. Discourse only can be dialectical. All people have different perspectives, realities, truths that have to be reconciled in discourse. I'm only opposing the simulated discourse here, which makes no distinction between relative truths, which can be negotiated, and absolute truths, where a negotiation between truth and lies leads to the discourse dissolving into complete abstraction. What I will try to do here is to untangle all this confusion a little, or not, and, in the name of the Golden Gate Bridge, enter into the intricacies of present, past and future, and trace relationships of constructs, linked in space and time. Europe. During state visits by politicians from the West to non-Western countries, it is always part of the procedure to address human rights violations that occur in these countries. This puts Western countries in the position of knowing better and being able to admonish the not-so-civilized countries. This narrative is also often used to justify acts of war, such as the war in Afghanistan, which ended disastrously in 2021. The West always refers to Western values, which stand for democracy, human rights, freedom of opinion, freedom of press, free education, the free development of one's personality. And these are all great things that probably no one would want to do without. But at the same time, the West often doesn't take these values very seriously regarding its own actions. For example, allowing thousands of people to drown in the Mediterranean Sea every year. And in this dishonesty, this Western idea is falling apart more and more, becoming less and less credible. This is not intended to be a pamphlet in the sense of the West is evil. These values are great in concept. It is intended to be an appeal to take these values seriously once and for all. Because as it is now, this European Western idea is a simulation. And, if you like, this European idea has always been a simulation. Because what is this Europe? And I don't mean the continent so much as the European idea. Where does it come from? Here's a quick speedrun through the European narrative. Antiquity. Europe has agreed on a linear historical narrative that begins with ancient Greece. Here, according to the narrative, is the origin of European culture, Western values, Western philosophy, and democracy. The demos, the people of this democracy, was of course only a tiny minority, and purely male. Women had no right to vote, and the vast majority of people were slaves, owned by this minority. It would take several millennia of European history before women were given the right to vote, or any rights at all. And the issue of slavery is still part of how the European idea works today. That ancient Greece was a big bang, before which there was nothing like it, and from which this culture suddenly emerged is obviously a fiction. Even here, there was something like a global discourse, mutual influences, and inspiration from different cultures. there cannot be a starting point for one culture. And already the concept of one culture is difficult at least. But I digress. Let's stick to the narrative of Europe, with ancient Greece as the Big Bang. The next step in this linear history is ancient Rome, which appropriated the aesthetics and culture of Greece, including renamed gods and mythical figures. The only difference is that temples were no longer mathematical marvels with curved columns, but only temples with simple straight columns. So what we have here is a Hollywoodified, Disneyfied Greece, a simulated Greece. In addition, the Romans created civilizational achievements such as the sewer system and were a huge colonial power. The Renaissance. Then comes the Middle Ages in this historiography, for which there's also a certain fetish, with kings and queens, castles, knights and whatnot. But medieval times don't play such a big role in the European narrative. Where the European narrative picks up speed again is in the 15th century, with the Renaissance, which, as the name suggests, was supposed to be a rebirth of the lost high culture of antiquity in the Middle Ages. No more gods were copied here, as the Roman Empire has become Christian in the meantime. But the aesthetics in art and architecture of antiquity were once again eagerly simulated. However, the sculptures inspired by antiquity were now white, as people had forgotten in the meantime that the now white sculptures of antiquity had once been colorfully painted. The philosophy of the now emerging Enlightenment, which plays a big role in how we think today and what values we have, also refers linearly to the philosophy of ancient Greece. Now we are slowly approaching America. In the 16th century, Europeans from various countries began to colonize America, the New World, and to displace, enslave, and largely murder the people who already have lived there. On this continent, or continents, but I will concentrate here on North America, another simulation was now created, based on Europe, which was a simulation of ancient Rome, which was a simulation of ancient Greece. Again, there are no suspiciously many columns, like here in Washington DC. To this end, Europeans, who had meanwhile begun to colonize and oppress the rest of the world, deported people from Africa to America, to keep them there as slaves, and create the new Europe in America. Let's jump into the 20th century. Nazi Germany. An absolutely crucial point in European history is Nazi Germany, which also saw itself as a continuation of the Roman Empire in the narrative strand described here. Aesthetically too, attempts were made to dock onto glorious European antiquity, if you look at Albert Speer's architecture or Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda films, for example. Like here in her film Olympia from 1938, with muscular bodies that look like ancient statues. The Germans murdered at least 17 million people, until the non-fascist countries of Europe, including the USA, joined forces and put an end to the terror. The modern age. And thus begins a new chapter in the history. In the history centered on Europe I'm telling here. The modern world. Germany was denazified, or not, and became one of the largest economic powers in the world, including all of the companies that had become large during the Nazi era through forced labor, expropriation of Jewish property, and the war industry, and are still big today. This economic rise, the 𝖔𝖍𝖏𝖚, was made possible by major financial support from the USA and also by millions of so-called guest workers, first mainly from Italy, then mainly from Turkey. Also, welfare states were established in Europe to make capitalism more human, to provide medical care for all, to provide education for all, to protect people from poverty. That concept was already introduced before the Second World War though. The European colonial projects were also largely ended. The colonized states, which in most cases are constructs of Europe and did not even exist before colonialism, became independent and were free. No, of course they were not free. Because the crimes of colonialism were never even remotely attempted to be addressed. On the contrary, the exploitation of these newly independent countries continued, and continue to this day, including with new players such as China. But the enlarged European world continues to be the biggest profiteer of the global structures of inequality created in the history of European colonialism. But I digress. Back to the post-war period. The United Nations, based in New York, were also founded, with the aim of world peace, diplomacy, respect for human rights, and the enforcement of those. With the exception of Palestine and the Vatican, both of which have observer status, most countries in the world are members of the UN. And while we're on the subject of Palestine and the UN, what has happened in the last few months began while I was in the final stages of this text, this film. October 7th was only a few days after I finished this text, and in the middle of the production of this film. I struggled for a long time with including this complex here, as it is very difficult, or perhaps even impossible, to break it down in its monstrosity and complexity in such a way that it's not portrayed too simplistically, but also doesn't blow up the whole film. But it has to find its place here, as it brings together a lot what this film is about. The double standards of the West, in which universal human rights are suddenly no longer universal anymore. And the multidimensionality, the intricacy of history, where continuities become visible that are hidden in the simulation, where simulation and reality break apart. First to the UN. The founding of the United Nations is an incredible achievement in today's world of nation-states to prevent something like the Second World War from happening again. All states in the world have agreed to abide by certain rules, international law. And if a state violates these rules, there are institutions that prosecute these violations, and a court that punishes them. Of course, there are some problems here, in the details. Contradictions, veto rights, violations that nobody cares about. Just think of the border policy of the Nobel Peace Prize winner European Union. But conceptually, we have institutions here that stand above the nations and are supposed to ensure universal justice. The State of Israel was also founded after the Second World War, in 1948, as a result of the industrial mass murder of Jews by Germany. The foundation of Israel has been a highly contested topic ever since, also inside of the Jewish community. With different historical narratives, both Jews and Arabs lay claim to the territory, which was previously a British colony. The State of Palestine, consisting of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which was proclaimed 1988 after decades of armed conflict and became autonomous or semi-autonomous in 1994, was never able to develop into a stable state. On the one hand, because it was divided within itself, and, on the other, because Israel always had control over the territories in various forms. Palestine has always been dependent on humanitarian aid from the international community, which is now lacking, leading to catastrophic conditions, hunger, death. Following the terrible terrorist attack by Hamas on October 7th, on a music festival and various kibbutzes with over 1,000 deaths and over 200 hostages, the far-right government of Israel, which despite clear signs and knowledge of the plans, was unable to prevent the attack, announced that it would raze the Gaza Strip to the ground and began to put this into practice. Officially, the aim was to eliminate Hamas and free the hostages. But since there is obviously no consideration for the civilian population, which is a war crime, and tens of thousands, probably soon hundreds of thousands, of people have been killed by the Israeli army, even aid organizations have been targeted, even some hostages have been killed, virtually no house is left standing in the Gaza Strip, virtually no food deliveries are allowed into this area, something that the Israeli politics have also announced from the outset. There can be little doubt that these official goals are bogus claims, which also can be seen in how the Israeli government envisions the future of Gaza, replaced by a clone of Dubai for rich people. At the same time, the whole of German politics and the majority of the media are unable to state the obvious, namely that things are happening that are absolutely incompatible with the way we understand our values. Instead, a narrative is being built up that the Israeli government, in its action of self-defense to neutralize Hamas and to free the hostages, is just not doing enough to protect the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. But Israel is a democratic state that is only defending itself, and everyone makes mistakes. And in this actively looking away, the non-acceptance of reality, and the corresponding flight into simulation, a previously unimaginable wave of cancel culture has broken out in culture and academia. Entire exhibitions are being cancelled, professorships terminated, just because one person signed an open letter at some point showing solidarity with Palestine. You can think what you like about boycott movements, and there are certainly anti-Semitic traits in them that should be criticized, but restricting the freedom of art and science, especially when you look at what is happening in reality outside the simulation, it has to be said, fascist traits. Whereas art and culture used to be proud of being able to poke the finger in the wound and show controversial issues, and were thus an important corrective within the simulation, professorships or exhibitions dealing with the genocide of the Herero Nama that Germans committed in their colonial era are now just being cancelled, without any further ado. All cool and normal. Which makes the term of the simulation I'm using here very clear. A new reality is being built here, in which everyone who addresses the obvious is labeled anti-Semitic, even if they are Jews. And since anti-Semitism is a killer argument, any discussion is over immediately, hard facts are created, universities are evacuated, protests are beaten down, exhibitions are cancelled. Which is terrible, because anti-Semitism is of course still a huge problem. But this political softening removes it from any meaning. What is particularly bizarre about the debate, but ultimately also logical, is that right-wingers have appropriated the term. Right-wingers who would also prefer if all Jews lived in Israel and not in their own countries. And right-wingers who, since the rise of the new right, have had friendly relations with the right-wing Netanyahu. 𝖕𝖕𝖊𝖏𝖃𝖏, himself a Jew, but also inventor of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about George Soros, which has developed into the Great Replacement theory propagated by Elon Musk and Donald Trump, helped both Viktor Orban in Hungary and Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel to come to power. With smear campaigns that are very reminiscent of today's smear campaigns by Trump and right-wing politics and media around the globe. And speaking of Elon Musk, the great confusion and decontextualization of the term anti-Semitism is also evident in him. While he has been conspicuous for his anti-Semitic statements in recent years, after October 7th and the subsequent, as Putin would say, special operation by the Israeli army in Gaza, he naturally sided with the far-right Israeli government, which is in the process of committing war crimes. War crimes for which to prevent the United Nations were founded, also as the result of the Second World War. So back to the post-war period. By now, the USA, the land of Europeans abroad, is the leading world power that has emancipated itself from its ancestors. You could even say that the situation has turned around. Through military, political and cultural influence, Europe has become an American simulation. Pop culture, which was and is particularly influenced by African American music, black music, plays a special role in this. And combined with Hollywood, which has played a leading role in the world of film since the beginning of the 20th century, the USA has had and continues to have an enormous cultural influence on the world. And also the world of intellectual discourse today, at least in Europe, is determined by US discourse, and European discourse is largely a simulation of it. This works in part because we live in a globalized world in which discourses can be transferred. But even in a globalized world, there are regional differences, different structures, and correspondingly different structural problems that are lost if US discourses are simulated elsewhere. Politically, European modernity was defined by the Cold War, between the West and, on the other side, the Soviet Union, which was dominated by the European colonial power Russia, which very successfully focused its expansion activities to the Asian continent. So Russia is no longer part of the West, but the epitome of the communist East. Nevertheless, I think it is important to emphasize that the Russian expansion is also European colonialism. Now there was a Cold War between two European camps that dominated the world, because Europe dominated the world. The post-bipolar world. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the end of the Cold War, the USA was finally the absolute world power. A world power built by Europeans for Europeans. Meanwhile, in the 90s, many countries in Europe, especially in Western Europe, joined forces to found the European Union, which was committed to human rights, democracy, freedom of expression, in short, to Western values. Russia became relatively insignificant after the fall of the Iron Curtain, but a new great power was able to establish itself in the 90s. China. Starting out as the country that produced, and still produces, cheap products for the West under terrible working conditions, China was able to emancipate itself as a political and economic player that can take on the West and compete with it, one that is challenging the hegemony of the USA. But this is not about China, but about Europe and the USA. What also happened in the 90s and was to change everything was the emergence of the internet, which, if you take out China's internet, which is a world of its own, has enormous US dominance. Monopolies quickly formed in the noughties and tens, almost all of which came from a small region in the USA, only around 100 by 30 kilometers in size, in California. The Silicon Valley. But first to California. Here I have to rewind time for a moment, as a number of very different things culminate here, which initially have little to do with each other, but ultimately come together, which tells us a lot about the current state of our world. The hippie culture. Hippie culture emerged in San Francisco in the 60s as a counter-movement to the conservative meritocracy. The hippie culture, which consisted mainly on white middle-class children, was a peace movement, but very individualistically oriented. It can be seen as a very naive movement that saw the achievement of peace in finding oneself and realizing oneself. People experimented with psychedelic drugs, love, peace, rock and roll. That was a very exaggerated and simplified history of hippie culture, which certainly doesn't do it justice. After all, the movement spawned extremely important things, such as the women's rights movement. Anti-racism was an important issue, and the rebellion against the conservative meritocracy was certainly very necessary, and still has a positive effect today in terms of what free development means for us. And especially in this day and age, it would not be wrong to have a large peace movement. Parallel to the hippie movement, San Francisco was also one of the centers of the LGBT movement, which also gained momentum in the 60s, alongside New York, which also was a hippie hotspot. The LGBT movement has a bit longer history though. So we can see that in this small corner of the world, if we take out the rebellion against meritocracy, where the sails have now turned, the foundations were laid for what we now call progressive politics. At the same time, in the 60s, in the immediate neighborhood, something emerged that we know today as Silicon Valley. For this, Stanford University is very important. Intelligence. But before I get to Silicon Valley, I need to go back in time a little further, to something that also has to do with Stanford University, and, as it will turn out later, Silicon Valley. From the end of 19th century, Europeans, especially in Germany, the UK and the USA, were obsessed with the concept of intelligence, in the conviction that they were superior to others, or as a justification for atrocities already committed and atrocities yet to be committed, they developed the pseudoscience of eugenics, according to which one could measure how intelligent a person was, how worthy of life a person was. Eugenics led to so-called racial segregation laws in many European countries, and the Nazis used the anti-miscegenation laws in the USA as a model for the Nuremberg laws. And they later used this pseudoscience as justification to murder millions of people on an industrial scale. But the Holocaust should not distract from the fact that eugenics was popular throughout Europe and the USA. In California in particular, eugenics was booming at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1921, California was responsible for 80% of all sterilizations in the USA, in accordance with the eugenic sterilization law, which forced people with certain characteristics to be sterilized. In 1916, the eugenicist Louis Terman published the Stanford revision of the 𝖕𝖔𝖆 scale at Stanford University. He was inspired by the concept of Intelligenzquotient, IQ, which the German William Stern, who was not a eugenicist, and as a Jew was forced to flee to the USA in the 1930s, had established. Louis Terman revised the 𝖕𝖔𝖆 scale, designed by the French Alfred Binet and Théodore Simon, into the Stanford revision of it, which in an extended form is still the well-known and practiced IQ test today. This eugenic idea of measurable intelligence will later play a role in so-called artificial intelligence. But for now, let's move on to Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley. In the 1960s, parallel to the rise of the hippie movement, Stanford University began to promote high technology, due to the Cold War, initially mainly for aviation. Graduates of Stanford University began to found companies in the area surrounding the university. Semiconductor companies, which gave Silicon Valley its name, settled relatively soon. Silicon Valley, the Valley of Silicon, which is important for the production of semiconductor electronics, computer processors. From the 70s onwards, software companies also set up in the area, with global success. And from the 90s onwards, the thing that would change everything took off, the internet. Here too, the most important internet companies were founded in Silicon Valley, by Stanford graduates. Today, most of these companies are conglomerates that offer both hardware and software, as well as internet services. And of course, they are all heavily invested in so-called artificial intelligence. which starts to become the next big thing in the mid-teens. I'll get to that in a moment, but first I want to move to another simulation that changed everything: social networks. They became big in the zeros, and in the tens they homogenized and monopolized and took over the world. Of course, and with all the negativity that's about to come, it's important to not forget this, social networks have also generated a lot of positive things. Online scenes of all kinds have developed, right from the start. Like-minded people who would otherwise never have met were able to get to know each other, and friendships developed. Groups of people who previously had no voice, no publicity, were suddenly audible, and were able to draw attention to things that had previously happened in silence. Movements such as the German Aufschrei movement, or later the Me Too movement, drew attention to omnipresent sexist structures. With the help of social networks, in the Arab Spring millions of people joined forces, in the, in hindsight unfortunately unsuccessful, fight for democracy and freedom. In Iran, a huge revolutionary movement developed 2022, following the murder of Jina Mahsa Amini by the Guidance Patrol. In the USA, the Black Lives Matter movement has grown via social media, which has been campaigning against violence against people of color since 2013 in response to racist murders by the police, and which has also taken on a global scale following the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And even in China, which has a censored, closed internet, movements regularly emerge that are directed against the regime. But let's move to the other side. The metaverse. Facebook founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg dreams of the metaverse, which is, surprisingly, based on a dystopian novel. In the 1992 book Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, people enter the metaverse with VR glasses to escape dystopian reality. Because of this fantastic vision, he also renamed his company to Meta. This metaverse takes place in a virtual world, where you enter with VR glasses and meet people, work, shop, spend your life. This idea is already considered a failure by many, and we have yet to see what will actually come out of it. But what I find even more compelling, and this is what I will use the term metaverse for from now on, is that the metaverse, or metaverses, were already created with the emergence of the internet, and then for real with social networks. I will distinguish here between two types of metaverses. The large metaverses, in which almost everyone is socially and parasocially active. Facebook's Facebook and Instagram, Google's YouTube, and TikTok from the Chinese company ByteDance. These are all the services, the metaverses, the simulations, in which a large part of the world's population is active. And the small metaverse, which for the last 10 years has consisted exclusively of the microblogging service Twitter, and which the majority of the world's population does not use, but which has been the main platform for discourse and communication for politics, media, celebrities, influencers, internet kids, and, of course, right-wing extremists who have recognized the influence they have through this network. Both types of metaverse, large and small, have in their own way had a huge impact on how the world has developed since their emergence. The large metaverses. The large metaverses quickly developed into platforms where everyone tries to present the best possible version of themselves. Everyone tries, more or less successful, to show what a great, exciting life they have, how productive, how successful, how popular they are. Interestingly, they refer back to the real analog world in which all this happens. The metaverse is therefore a simulation of the analog world. But only a simulation, as none of this really reflects people's lives, but is a controlled, auto-fictional story about their own lives. And this story naturally leaves out almost everything that doesn't fit into the story. Failures, misfortune, loneliness, etc. All things that are also part of every person's life. The positive aspects, on the other hand, are particularly embellished and staged, which also has an impact on the real world. Because when you turn your life into a real-life film, your life is also fictionalized, and you and your social environment become actors in your own life, which is recorded throughout. The people who are particularly successful in the story of themselves develop into influencers, who become role models for what it is like to have a good life. The machinery of the simulation social network works so well because with every interaction, with every like, we humans are rewarded by our bodies with dopamine, the treat for humans. And so we adapt our behavior to what works well algorithmically, in the fear of not performing well, and therefore not getting our treat. This creates an extreme momentum of its own, an extreme artificiality that increasingly decouples the simulation from real life. At the same time, we can observe the phenomenon of parasociality, which already existed before, for example by developing a kind of friendship with characters in a sitcom on television, but with influencers on YouTube, Instagram or TikTok, who are not only fictional characters but also real people. This phenomenon is extremely intensified. Influencers are perceived as real friends, which of course benefits the influencers, as they become extremely valuable advertising faces. However, many influencers also realize that this is not particularly helpful for either side and warn against being perceived as real friends. And other influencers, such as 𝖊𝖓𝖊𝖉𝖆 aka Miranda Sings, exploit and abuse this power relationship. And during the COVID pandemic, when many social contacts in the real world were broken off and people were largely only connected digitally, whether via social networks or video calls, this parasociality even extended to private circles, and we all entered a simulated world at the same time, which was noticeably not good for anyone. But back to social networks. Rabbit holes. The main recipe for success for social networks is to have good algorithms that not simply show users chronologically what the people they follow and have subscribed to have published, but to sort their posts according to their presumed interests, and also to show posts from accounts that they have not subscribed to, but which the algorithm classifies as interesting for the user. This goes so far that users are sometimes only shown algorithmically suggested content, and their own subscriptions play virtually no role. TikTok makes the most of this, with great success. These suggestion algorithms can be very useful for discovering new things and perspectives, but the algorithms can, depending on how they are adjusted, turn social networks into cybernetic radicalization machines. Through a feedback loop that is created by the algorithm suggesting something more extreme as soon as you have clicked on something extreme, which you then click on again and something even more extreme is suggested, which you then click on again and something even more extreme is suggested, which you then click on again and something even more extreme is suggested, and so on. So we can see a phenomenon in these metaverses, that the further you dive into the metaverse and isolate yourself from the real world, the more you disconnect from it, the more you find yourself in rabbit holes, echo chambers, in which a completely different reality exists, other laws prevail, the complete simulation, which no longer has any connection to the real world. This is the world of conspiracy myths, which, what a coincidence, very quickly pick up on the conspiracy myths of the past, especially that of the Jewish world conspiracy, which had its terrible peak of popularity in Nazi Germany. And speaking of rabbit holes, someone who fell into one is one of the richest people in the world, who ended up buying the platform we are about to talk about, in order to completely convert it into the rabbit hole he fell into, a high-rise rabbit house, so to speak. But first, let's talk about the platform in question, and its role in the world before Elon Musk bought it. The little metaverse. Founded in 2006, Twitter quickly developed into the platform that celebrities of all kinds, especially from the world of politics, used as their mouthpieces. They no longer had to take the detour via the traditional media to communicate with the public, but could communicate directly with it. Presumably because the big metaverses, initially particularly Facebook, already focused on personal relationships, a parallel universe, a small parallel metaverse was formed here, which was more manageable, as no personal friendships were cultivated here in the first place, leaving room for the public discourse. The media, which had already fallen into a crisis due to the internet, as virtually nobody wanted to pay for content anymore, and they now had to finance themselves primarily with online advertising, which is much less lucrative compared to the previous world of print and television, now had the additional problem that celebrities and politicians were now their own medium, and no longer needed the traditional media to communicate. Absurdly, this is not really true. The traditional media still plays an enormously important role in political communication and reporting today. As I said, most people were and are not on Twitter and continue to consume news largely through traditional channels, but the balance of power has changed fundamentally. More and more, and at the latest since Donald Trump's presidential candidacy in 2016 and his subsequent presidency, in which he almost exclusively used Twitter to communicate, the traditional media has become a second-hand medium, in which they report what happened on Twitter, who said what on Twitter. And so the whole of journalism went into this little metaverse and began to think it was the real world. However, the reality perceived on Twitter is an extreme distortion of the real world. On the one hand, as already mentioned, only a very specific group of people are represented there, who absolutely do not reflect the opinion of the population, And secondly, a charged culture of excitement and outrage has developed there. Justified outrage, of course, but also outrage for the sake of outrage, as this was the way to get likes, retweets, attention. Dopamine, in the system of this small metaverse. So that in the end, what was really outrageous was completely lost in the everyday uproar. Everyone lost focus on what was worthy of outrage and what was not. And at the same time, the neo-Nazis knew how to exploit this culture for themselves and were able to gain attention through targeted provocations that deserved absolutely no attention, which in turn influenced the media's distorted image of public opinion. And as if all that wasn't enough with social media, free speech activist Elon Musk bought Twitter for $44 billion in October 2022, after some back and forth, fired almost the entire workforce, had the accounts of users who criticized him suspended, blocked accounts of users who criticized him, stopped paying rent, renamed Twitter to the letter X, and happily retweeted neo-Nazis, ranted about the woke mind virus, challenged 𝖔𝖍𝖏 to a cage fight, and much, much more. He gradually adapted the platform, whose advertising business was now collapsing, to his idea of free speech. For example, by reopening the platform to Donald Trump and previously banned neo-Nazis, essentially making the platform unusable, both in terms of its usability and morally. But also due to the lack of alternatives, and presumably because of the cloud already built up among large users, despite all these developments, ex-Twitter remains, for the time being, the main platform for discourse, where politicians public important statements, major events are commented on, and so on. But it is, hopefully, only a matter of time. The ex-Twitter era implodes, and then perhaps something will emerge that does not have the negative characteristics that Twitter already had before the Musk era. Because having a functioning platform for public discourse wouldn't be a bad thing. A small glimmer on the horizon is perhaps the emergence of decentralized networks, such as Mastodon or even Threads from Facebook, which are based on the ActivityPub protocol and can communicate with each other across platforms, like email, only as a social network. And also, among others, Tumblr and WordPress have announced plans to integrate into the Fediverse, what this decentralized network is called. But let's see how this develops. The danger of monopolization is of course also very great here, especially if Facebook is involved. Especially since they introduced a policy in Instagram and Threads to deprioritize political content in their algorithm, whatever that means. Which is not good news for platforms for political discourse, I guess. And in other news concerning Facebook, they updated their terms of service that it allowed them to use all of their users' content for AI training, what they recalled quickly after, at least in the EU. Which brings us to the next topic. AI, the ultimate European simulation. With social media, we all have entered a simulation that we all, including its creators, do not understand, because it has fundamentally changed how we act and interact in the world. Another new development, where this is similar, and where the same companies are involved, is the emergence of so-called artificial intelligence. The metaverse that companies in Silicon Valley dream of, a simulated digital world, is not limited to social media. It is about the digitalization, the simulation of the entire world. Starting with Google, which, in addition to mapping and digitally measuring the physical world, with Google Maps and Google Earth, has mapped the internet, the digital reality, with its search engine, and thus made it accessible. This mapped reality in the form of collected data from the entire internet is now being used to feed the machines in which the simulation of the real world is to take place. The world simulation machine artificial intelligence. It is no coincidence that the same companies that operate social networks of various kinds are also working on this grand divine idea of artificial intelligence, which is rapidly merging into transhumanist ideology. For the internet companies, for whom everything is just data points, people are also just data points. They are part of a simulation that they observe and in which they can recognize patterns in how people behave in the simulation. And they use these patterns to train their algorithms so that the people connected to the simulation function even more smoothly in the simulation. From the perspective of these companies, the behavior of people is like a smoke simulation, in which billions of data points are linked together to simulate smoke. And with this view of humanity, it is not surprising that the various transhumanist ideologies are all based on the eugenics concept of intelligence from the beginning of the 20th century, described before. humans must be optimized, the undesirable weeded out, in order to create the superhuman in the end. AI researcher 𝖕𝖕𝖉𝖆𝖏 says the following about this in Adam Conover's podcast Factually, where it is also worth listening to the entire episode.
So the Tusk Real Bundle is a bunch of ideologies that are all sort of descendants of the first wave eugenics movement. And when you hear this word about human flourishing, maximizing our potential through both positive and negative eugenics. Positive would be the ones who are desirable, you want them to breed, you want them to, multiply, right? And the ones who are negative, the ones who are undesirable, you want to kind of get rid of them because they don't help you with this human flourishing thing. So the transhumanists, were very much, that ideology was very much developed by 20th century eugenicists.
And, further still, what 𝖕𝖕𝖉𝖆𝖏 and Emily Bender also talk about in this podcast is a much-cited paper by researchers at Microsoft, in which they very grandly claim to show sparks of intelligence in the large language model GPT-4. In this paper, they used a 1994 eugenics document as a reference for the definition of intelligence, which uses a definition of intelligence that divides people into different intelligence classes based on their race, measured by the IQ mentioned earlier. This quote has since been removed from the Microsoft paper, but the original can still be found on the internet. And, surprisingly, the whole thing goes full circle with the new chatbot from Elon Musk's company xAI, which, funnily enough, is too woke for its fans, and which also accesses Twitter for its text generation. If you ask it about race in connection to IQ, it spits out eugenic results that divide people into different intelligence classes according to their race. The intelligence, referred to as artificial intelligence, is a misanthropic idea of intelligence. Anti-human in two dimensions. Firstly, it is generally misanthropic, as it is based on a purely technical concept of humanity. The human as a machine, the machine as a human. And specifically misanthropic towards non-European people. The propagated holism of artificial intelligence, which claims to know everything, to depict a complete, neutral picture of the world, is a lie, as there is no neutral picture of the world, nor can there be. But in the simulation of a ChatGPT, for example, this neutral truth is then the whole world. It is therefore no surprise that OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, has brought in the right-wing libertarian German Axel Springer Verlag, which is expanding rapidly in the USA, and whose boss also played a role in the purchase of Twitter from Elon Musk, as its first online media partner. For a deeper integration of journalism in AI technologies, which truths are prioritized by such chatbots should be very clear here. And this distorted neutral truth also has further consequences in the real world. For example, police forces in many countries use AI-powered software to predict crime, which leads to increased police presence in non-white neighborhoods due to the racist bias of these AIs, because in the simulation, foreigners are criminal, of course, which in turn leads to more crimes being recorded in these areas, which are fed back into the system, giving us a racist cybernetic machine, which, in combination with structural racism in the police forces of the, especially Western world, has real consequences that affect the life of real people. The fact that AIs have been trained with a Eurocentric view of the world now simulate a Eurocentric world, and this is presented and perceived as a complete truth, is a continuation of the idea of European dominance in the world, the European simulation that pervades European history. Autonomous vehicles. Another aspect of artificial intelligence is robots and vehicles that move autonomously in the physical world. There's an interesting interplay here between the simulated world in the machine's computer center and the physical world. The better the simulation works, the better the machine can move in the real world. Like the origins of Silicon Valley, autonomous vehicles also have a military background, and autonomous warfare will become more and more important in the future. But to the civilian use of autonomous vehicles. In California, you can already see autonomous cars from various companies driving around everywhere. And in Los Angeles, I also saw some delivery robots. Gig economy versus AI. Another company that was invested in autonomous driving was San Francisco-based Uber, an online transportation service, not to be confused with taxis, and other ride-hailing services. However, Uber got out of autonomous driving in 2020, which brings us to the other side of the platform economy. cheap human labor. Just as these companies are using lowest paid people for training their AI models, this also works perfectly in the gig economy around the globe. The companies simply offer an app that assigns workers jobs such as passenger transportation or food delivery. In the case of passenger transportation, the workers use their own cars that only drive under the name of Uber. These companies operate a cab service without ever having to own a single car or hire a driver. To just build a shiny app and let people use their own cars is simply far cheaper for them than owning and operating cars themselves and being responsible for them in terms of taxes, maintenance or accidents. But in latest news, Uber is now collaborating with Google's Waymo, that you can use the Uber app to book Waymo's autonomous cars, with them more expensive than cars with human drivers. Haha. Where the idea of an automated world, in which everyone has to work less, propagated by OpenAI boss and founder Sam Altman for example, falls apart, despite I generally support the idea of an unconditional basic income. The gamification of the world of work that is underway here is a simulation in its own right, but that's another story. Hollywood versus AI. Something is also happening in Hollywood regarding AI. On March 2, 2023, the Writers Guild of America in Hollywood went on strike, and on July 14, 2023, the Screen Actors Guild also joined the strike, meaning that virtually no film production could take place in Hollywood for months. Among other things, the strike was directed against the use of artificial intelligence, which on the one hand of course makes many great things possible, but on the other hand threatens the livelihoods of many workers. We can already see some examples of this. Digital doppelgangers of actors are being created to save shooting days with the real actors. They can stay at home, but are also not paid for their digital appearance. Even real-life doubles, such as stunt people, are already being cut, which is threatening an entire sector of the film industry. Another profession that is likely to face existential problems very soon is that of voice actors. It is already possible to clone the sound of an individual's voice and have a person speak a different language. Together with synchronized lip movements, this has the potential to abruptly end the culture of dubbing. The simulation of Hollywood. However, the strike goes even deeper and is fundamentally directed against the working conditions in Hollywood and the exploitative practices of the new players in the film business, the streaming services, who are in the process of turning Hollywood into a kind of gig economy. They are on the way to completely transform the economic structures of the film world. Where it used to be the case that money flowed to the creators every time a film was shown in cinemas or on television, not to mention physical media such as DVDs, which until recently were responsible for a large part of the film industry's turnover, streaming services have introduced the practice of only paying a certain amount once for the production of a work, regardless of how much profit is made from the product afterwards. This leads to enormous uncertainty and a very precarious situation for everyone involved. Not to mention the fact that streaming services are killing off what Hollywood stands for, the great cinema culture. When you see the old crumbling movie palaces on Broadway in Los Angeles, you can see that this culture itself is just a movie set, a shadow of its former self. What the strikers also complain about is that while on the surface the flags of diversity and progressiveness are held high, the structures in Hollywood are deeply sexist and racist. The power structures are dominated by white, aka European men. Hollywood, which produces fictional worlds with its films, is itself a fictional world, a simulation, a performance of glitz and glamour that is now being exposed by the strikes. So also this simulation reveals the historically determined European dominance. Hollywood bosses, meanwhile, were unimpressed by the strike and literally wanted to bleed it out. When the strikers can no longer afford an apartment, they would stop striking. The American Dream. The European power structures described here can also be applied to the USA in general. While US identity is multicultural and the USA is the prototypical country of immigration, the USA is still dominated by Europeans in terms of distribution of power, which also has to do with the American Dream. It embodies one of the basic philosophies of the USA as a country of immigration. No matter where you come from, what your basic requirements are, you can make it. You just have to try hard enough. This culture has the positive effect that it is normal to see people from all over the world, from all backgrounds, in all kinds of positions, and it is even encouraged. that there is generally a more open atmosphere than in Europe, which is noticeable everywhere, at least where I was, in cities in California and New York City. In other states, especially in rural areas, it may be different. But the truth is that this effort is not the only factor in making it. Individuals make it, of course, but the initial chances of making it are very different for people with different basic requirements. And telling poor people, you can make it, you just have to make an effort, does not solve the problem of inequality, which clearly still looks like Europeans are richer than the rest of the population, even if it has improved slightly in recent years. Especially in Silicon Valley, I could observe a clear wealth gap between the areas inhabited by Europeans and those inhabited by Hispanics. And if you look at cities in California, the richest country in the USA, the richest country in the world, such as Los Angeles or San Francisco, where people don't live in houses but in front of them, you can see that the American dream doesn't seem to be working too well. Conclusion. This inequality, which of course affects society as a whole, and must therefore be tackled by society as a whole, but particularly affects non-Europeans, is the structural racism which plays no role in the left liberal progressive simulation. Because if you would break out of the simulation, you would very quickly reach the limits of the system that protects the wealth of the few, which has been inherited and increased over generations. The American dream is a tool for ignoring this inequality, as anyone can make it if they just try hard enough. In the left liberal simulation, we dream of a better world, in which all people are equal and live together in peace. But in this simulation, we don't get to this better world by changing historically established structures, but by finding ourselves. And this focus on self-discovery has found its way from the scruffy hippies back then into the entire progressive liberal part of society. I see the simulation in which we live as a culmination of very different things that, when mixed together, lead to a cocktail of confusion. The separation of structural problems in social politics according to the third way of social democracy in the 1990s and zeros. If the politics of the left-wing mainstream only simulate social politics, and at the same time does the opposite, it is no wonder that our entire political understanding dissolves into abstraction, becomes a simulation. In addition, the general symbolification of progressive politics, which is more about individual attitude than actual change, and whose origins I see in hippie culture, which was less interested in the structures of post-colonial inequality and global and local exploitation than in a superficial feel-good better world. And finally, social networks, which have once again immeasurably increased the focus on individual attitude as self-presentation, in which we all can be activists by posting info slides on Instagram. Activism that, as we have seen again and again in recent years, fizzles out again and again. And, although we can observe a hyperpolitization in social media, the world, politics and society are moving in the opposite direction. So today we are in the age of neoliberal self-realization, which is not to be confused with communist self-realization, which has the opposite goal, which is to realize oneself and not to exploit oneself, as in the neoliberal version. This version of self-realization has also brought the liberal, progressive parts of our societies to a productivity fetish. A work, self-optimization mindset, which is opposed to the anti-performance idea of the hippies, but harmonizes perfectly with the idea of the American dream, the bad side of both worlds. It also fits very well that both the hippie culture back then and the Silicon Valley billionaires today want to find their way to themselves with psychedelic drugs. In the end, we are all more concerned with ourselves than with the rest of the world, and when we are, it is often only parasocial and not really with each other. And so we are all trapped together in a simulation, in which problems are tackled individually, not structurally, which is fatal, because, as mentioned at the beginning, there is an extremely unequal distribution overall, locally and globally, which literally affects 99% of all people, across all classes, backgrounds, etc. And within this 99%, there are of course an infinite number of other inequalities, each of which has its own structural reasons and historical origins. It is a huge dialectical knot that cannot be untied. As a result, there are an infinite number of unresolvable conflicts if you get lost in this knot and approach everything individually, and you don't look at the knot as a whole. But it must be seen as a whole. This not must also include climate change, which will exacerbate the whole situation, and for which, historically speaking, Europe is also responsible. But in the simulation we can stop climate change with technologies that don't exist yet, but which will surely be developed soon. Which is, literally and sarcastically, fantastic, because then we can just carry on as before, postponing the problems to a distant abstract future. At the same time, in the equally fantastic post-humanist simulation, it is already too late anyway, which is why we have to digitize ourselves in this simulation and colonize the universe, which leads to the same conclusion. Here on Earth, we can carry on as before. In the simulation, we can save the world with recycling. The huge landfills in Africa do not exist in the simulation. The simulation is a fictitious world, in which different rules apply. The exciting thing about the simulation is that, although it is disconnected from the real world, we know about all these things within the simulation. More than ever through the existence of the internet, social networks, the metaverse. But we can simply block them out. We also don't find it weird at all that most politicians speak in talk shows and interviews as if they were run by an AI. On the contrary, when politicians exceptionally break out of the simulation, it seems unprofessional. Journalists are overwhelmed by the non-generic answers, because they themselves only have generic questions in stock. I don't want to generalize this either. Fortunately, there are many exceptions. But there's also a clear trend. But perhaps we should stop accepting being governed by human machines that, like NPCs, constantly repeat the same phrases that mean nothing. Perhaps we should take to the streets if the right to asylum is abolished. Perhaps we should step out of the simulation, change structures, actually repair the global damage caused by colonialism, which is still ubiquitous, and which is the reason for the refugee flows that the right-wing propagandists are campaigning against. And by that I don't mean development aid, but a concept that actually creates justice in a non-colonialist way, instead of pretending that it will all somehow sort out itself, and not constantly talking about values and at the same time acting contrary to them without hesitation. Maybe we should normalize the opinion that it should be illegal for billionaires and trillionaires who own as much as half of all humanity to exist. Maybe we should stop the social alienation caused by social media and spend less time in the metaverse and more time meeting in the real world, and advocate for community spaces that aren't churches or shopping malls or clubs that cost $20 to enter. That also would be an opportunity for city centers that are dying out because of online shopping. And yes, these are structural changes that cannot be tackled individually. But maybe this is all far too complicated and daydreamy, and we should all just take more psychedelic drugs and enter multidimensional intertwined worlds. That certainly wouldn't be wrong either.